Hi, my name's Eric Johnson, and I am the subject matter expert for this course, in part because I also happen to have written the textbook for this course. And that's because I've been involved in the field of Christian psychology and counseling for many years, and this class represents a focus on what I think to be at the heart of the project of a Christian psychology. So ideally, folks that take this class will be starting out in the program, one of the programs that the Gideon Institute of Christian Psychology and Counseling is offering, and either an MA in Christian Counseling or an MA in Christian Psychology, as well an MA in Christian Psychological Studies, actually 3 degrees now. And yet we also welcome anybody who takes this class for whatever reason, but it's considered to be one of the beginning classes for students entering these programs. And it is an introduction to the theoretical framework of Christian psychology and counseling, and to some degree an introduction to what is the core courses of these degree programs that the Gideon Institute offers. These 7 courses include a focus on distinctly Christian forms of spiritual formation, a theology course, and a biblical studies course, a Christian philosophy course, all of them geared towards helping to provide a Christian foundation for psychology and counseling, as well as a class on distinctly Christian counseling techniques. And I don't think I touched on all of them, but those are the most important. I mention them because these are courses that are not required for licensure. However, from a Christian psychology standpoint, they are foundational to the whole rest of the degree. And it's our hope and wish that the underlying philosophy and theology that you'll be exposed to in this course will be saturating all the courses in the curriculum, including all of those that lead to licensure, that are required for licensure, that other programs have, but will not have the Christian psychology foundation that we trust our courses will have. My purpose in this video is just to give you an introduction to this particular course. Christian psychology has a long history going back at least to Jesus, and really back even further into biblical revelation and God's relationships with people ever since the fall happened. And yet, and because of this long history, Christianity has had a psychology. It's in incipient form in the Bible. It's there, but it's not written in the way that modern psychology is written, and therefore it has to be drawn out. And that takes, I think, some special insight and training, a certain kind of hermeneutic, a way of interpreting the Bible for these purposes. But on the other hand, the healing of the soul, which psychotherapy is sort of a term that means etymologically the healing of the soul, is at the heart of God's saving agenda since the beginning of human history. And therefore, we have no problems seeing psychology in the Bible and throughout the history of the Christian tradition, even though it does not conform to modern standards of what counts as knowledge, at least in complete agreement with those standards. And because of that, Christian psychology has made little impact on modern psychology. there are Christians who have worked in modern psychology using the rules of modern psychology, and they've made a difference, and they've done some really wonderful things in terms of even changing the field, research on the benefits of religious belief, religious values in therapy, research on gratitude and other virtues, and as well as forgiveness. A lot of research been done by Christians in the field, and they made a difference. And we in Christian psychology are deeply excited about that work and supportive of that work. I've done some publications in mainstream journals myself, but most of my work has been dedicated to helping Christians to think Christianly about the field of psychology. And that is, to some degree, that's the main calling of a Christian psychology, though by no means the only one. That should become clear throughout the course of this book. But I wanted to begin this little introduction sort of explaining briefly why it is that Christian psychology hasn't had that much of an impact. It has had virtually no impact on modern psychology, except indirectly through the work of Christians who do their work according to the rules of mainstream psychology. Something happened in the late 1800s that was, some would say, revolutionary. The great Christian sociologist Christian Smith edited a book in 2003 called The Secular Revolution, and his essay is masterful. It's an enormous essay, about 70 pages, but it gives an amazing overview of how secularism took over the intellectual power centers of Western culture in the late 1800s throughout the early part of the 20th century. So it's really responsible to say that by 1950, all major universities, public universities in the West, were functionally secularized. And so this revolution has had an enormous impact on all of our lives, because we've all grown up after this revolution was a done deal, and all universities in America, to some degree, reflect the impact of this secular revolution. Because of the rules of discourse and the rules of education and science of secularism, reference to supernatural beings, power, change making was forbidden, essentially, unless you were being merely descriptive, and then often it would be accompanied by a sort of condescending critique of the religious discourse. And there became then a shift in worldview allegiance at all universities and all institutions influenced by them. So Christians basically had to go into the closet if they were to remain active in the academy, at least in the terms of being a Christian, because in some fields you wouldn't be able to get a job if you were explicitly Christian. But more problematic than that, if you wanted to get a PhD in any field outside of biblical studies, and more recently, I would say outside philosophy departments that are supportive of Christian philosophy approach, you would be socialized into a secular worldview, usually without an explicit agenda being spelled out. And because of that, Christians, I'm afraid to say, and rather naively entered into the public university, get their PhDs, and then when they returned to teach at Christian colleges and universities, they were teaching a secular version of the discipline and not realizing it, kind of naively, just assuming that since all truth is God's truth, and universities teach truth, then what we're teaching is God's truth, without having a sufficient appreciation that you get from philosophy and theology to enable us to interpret these secularized disciplines from a Christian worldview standpoint. Certainly this has been talked about over the last 50 to 70 years by Christians. Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and evangelicals certainly have made reference to that agenda. But I'm persuaded at this stage of my career that all of us, myself included, were naive about how easy that could be done. And I think because worldview assumptions are rarely explicit, and in particular, secular worldview assumptions are supposed to be implicit, or I should say, are not recognized. Part of the genius, I think I can say, tragic genius of modern scholarship is the thought that they were being neutral regarding worldview issues and religious issues and so on, not realizing that secularism is a very decided stance towards reality and interpreting reality. Undergirding or associated with secularism is the worldview of naturalism, which says there are no supernatural forces or persons in the universe, and we came here as a result purely by naturalistic evolution and chance. Christians who, well-meaning Christians who got into the field of psychology simply, I think, underestimated how secular worldview assumptions were embedded in the discipline and taught in many ways implicitly. And this has really stunted Christian scholarship over the last 70 years in the human sciences. And the place where we see the most exciting work in the last 40 years has been in the area of Christian philosophy and to some degree Christian theology, where those rules have been challenged and successfully. But we have only begun to challenge the secular rules in psychology and the other human sciences. So I'm referring to these rules of knowledge, of what counts as good science. These rules are not so much explicitly articulated as I'm suggesting they ought to be. Philosophers of science have done a good job of highlighting some of this that I benefited from, but there is nonetheless a rule system that's in place that has created conditions up until recently, at least, where an explicit Christian perspective, for example, could not be a part of a research article and get published. I myself, when I was a very young academic, submitted a journal article to the Journal of Phenomenological Psychology on fear of the dark that had that I did the rules of phenomenological psychology, secular rules for the research, and then at the end I did a Christian interpretation, and it was rejected. And they were very explicit about that. They said they really liked the research that I did. They did not like the Christian interpretation, and that's one of the reasons why most of my career I spent dedicated to the Christian community. But that's not, that wasn't my own experience of an underlying, I would call it a polite hostility towards a religious agenda in my doctoral program. And that wasn't just unique at Michigan State University by any means, but it's been the norm. A wonderful book on this topic has been written by George Marsden called The Soul of the American University, that recounts how the secularism overcame the American university, which was, for a couple hundred years, a Christian institution. And I think that's very important for us in the 21st century to be aware of these dynamics if we're going to properly interpret what we're experiencing in public universities. So what that means is that Christians in the field of psychology simply didn't realize how much they had been affected by secular psychology and a secular worldview perspective, and therefore don't really understand how to challenge it. And then, even more importantly, how to imagine an alternative conceptualization and practice of psychology and psychotherapy along Christian lines. And then the last reason why there's been little influence of Christianity in modern psychology, especially from a deeply Christian psychology standpoint, is we can't or haven't been able to get the funding that is necessary to contribute to mainstream journals in order to get published. That is changing, I think, in our day. It's beginning to change. Certainly the Templeton Foundation has moved funding decidedly in a more religious-friendly direction. Even there, the rules are that it's supposed to be generic religion and generic spirituality, and that's been the norm for the last 20, 30 years, when there has been more openness than there was at the time that I got my PhD. But it's still not heartily recognized across the field that there is a bias built into secular psychology, and that we need to to develop a more pluralistic approach to psychology. And that's going to take at least another generation before that will be widely recognized, I hope and pray. So what we're trying to do in the Gideon Institute of Christian Psychology and Counseling, and this course is an example and in some way a foundation to that agenda, is to develop in the 21st century a sophisticated, distinctly Christian approach to psychology that works especially with Christians, but is also equipping our students, and we believe Christian psychology has something to say to anyone who's interested in getting healing for the soul and wants to understand what Christianity offers that project. So in this class, we're going to stretch you, whoever is teaching this class, and then the materials that have been laid out in the format of this class will stretch you. And I hope that this course, and really the entire program, if you're in one of the MA programs that are specifically geared towards developing a Christian psychology or counseling model, that'll give you a very different understanding of psychology and counseling than dominates the field today, and that maybe you've been exposed to some degree if you got a psych undergrad, or you've taken some courses in mainstream psychology or counseling. That's because we're doing our best at this stage of development, a psychology and counseling approach that flows from a Christian vision of reality. What we hope reflects to some degree God's understanding of psychology and counseling. That's really what we're after here. At the same time, I want to be clear that advocates of Christian psychology universally desire, and all the members of our department desire, to collaborate with all those of goodwill in the field of psychology to contribute to the common good and to improve the psychological well-being of all those in our culture, especially of those who believe. I hope that you will find that to be true as you read the material and work through the materials of the course and interact with your peers. And I hope you enjoy this course. Thank you.